So, here we are. The 40th overall season of Doctor Who has ended, as has the 14th of the revival. Last time we saw a series finale was The Vanquishers, close to 3 years ago on the 5th of December 2021. It was a divisive ending to ultimately the last full series of the ultimately divisive Chris Chibnall era of Doctor Who. I remember being not as harsh on it as others were, as personally I think it more suffered the limitations of being the conclusion to an overly ambitious story arc that was promising but too short. Had it been the end of a 9-episode series, then perhaps it would have been better and would have been in service to a more well-ventilated and blossomed series of ideas. Like many of the Jodie Whittaker episodes, it had potential but was let down. This time, however, it's because of limitations with the contained and cramped 6-part format of this series, which in itself was too ambitious. Since then, we near enough got a repeat of David Tennant's 2009 to 2010 run, in that we pretty much got a full series worth of specials in between. Chibnall ended up completing a trilogy of New Year's specials featuring the Daleks, with Eve of the Daleks, and I honestly can't remember much about it or Legend of the Sea Devils, other than the former was the best of the trilogy of the specials just mentioned, and that both were average and disappointing. Looking back at sections of a YouTube video by DTWD, particularly ones on the Sea Devils episode and the next one, he made me think that I had watched this era quite lightly, and in turn they highlighted things I agreed with that I had never even thought about. Particularly terrible special effects in Legend, like with one of the aliens jumping on the boat. After a massively mixed and underwhelming tenure at the helm, did Chris deliver a satisfactory finale to his time on the show? Well, with a 90-minute closing episode here, which so happens to be the show's 300th story, I thought that surely he would be able to deliver something good. What I ended up getting was a celebratory cake with pretty much everything I could want on it, only to find that nobody had actually baked it before serving it to me. The Power of the Doctor is a weird one, not to mention that this episode was broadcasted on the 23rd of October 2022, one day after my 24th birthday. What a wild and weird gift. Thank you, Chibs. It has some great moments, but those are ultimately submerged in the sea of this episode's plot, which is very first draft-like and rushed. The biggest missed opportunity for this one, in my opinion, is the whole body swapping thing the Doctor and the Master did. This could have been a good way of concluding the controversial Timeless Child arc, in that this was the Master's plan all along. He knew that the Doctor had infinite lives and he wanted them for themselves. Instead, he just swaps bodies with her and they get changed back at the end of the episode for some ultimately inconsequential reason that I don't fully remember. I did like, however, that this was very much an initiation of a revival of UNIT, despite them being killed off in an earlier Dalek special, and how it reintroduced Ace and Tegan as agents of this organisation. This so far has been continued fairly well by RTD, but it's a shame that Ace and Tegan haven't reappeared as of yet. I also find the idea of an in-between plane of the regeneration process good, and the reunion of many companions in the end heartwarming. The Power of the Doctor is a mess, but sifting through the silt and mud that it is, I do find a couple gold nuggets here and there. It's weird, but for as jumbled and as chaotic as it is, it's a much better episode in terms of being purposeful to the 60th anniversary celebratory cause than any of the 3 episodes we actually got. About 13 months later, we finally got another episode in the form of The Star Beast, a comic book adaptation that opens the 60th anniversary series of specials. It's one that I'm ultimately indifferent upon, and it does a nice reintroduction of Tennant and Tate, but the scene in which they ask the Meep its pronouns is probably the worst in the show's history. I felt like I needed a fucking exorcism to rid myself of the putrid demon spawn that this scene is. I'm not homophobic, simply because I'm not stupid, but can we just not do this again, please? Wild Blue Yonder then came next and was a satisfactory horror episode that really appealed to me. It takes and borrows a lot from the cult 1990s horror film Event Horizon, so to me it's maybe a little unoriginal, but definitely a good entrant for the specials here. The Giggle ended this collection of celebratory episodes, celebratory in quotation marks, as I'm not sure what present in these 3 episodes does to celebrate 60 years of the show, with the return of a villain from 1960s Doctor Who, my favourite era of the show. It was good for the most part, but really? They defeated the Celestial Toymaker by playing catch? Are you kidding me? So, after a flawed but pretty good trilogy of specials, RTD's first series of his return began with its prologue on Christmas Day 2023, with the church on Ruby Road. Yeah, the first third of these 9 recent episodes is rough. The special here is the least offensive to me, as I probably couldn't prepare myself for the barbaric and deplorable degradation of quality that is Space Babies and the Devil's Chode, but for as cringe as it can be, it does a good job of setting things up, as does the next episode. The middle 3 episodes of the main series at hand is where it seemed to stabilise, at least a bit for me. Boom was a slap bang in the middle 6 out of 10 for me. Another episode that had great promise, but ultimately it's a cluttered and foggily done 45 minutes that just existed. There seems to have been some attempt and jest at religion and faith in the episode, with the soldiers having collars like priests would have, but it never amounted to much and just seemed to be a shoehorned way of displaying the message: don't have too much faith in technology and AI. We then got a big WTF but great episode of the time loop concentrated 73 yards. An episode that isn't going to be for everybody, but as a person that loves supernatural and folk horror, this appealed to me in a pretty big way. Not to mention I find it one of the scariest episodes in years, particularly because of the effects the entity has on UNIT. New Doctor Who has often had its fair share of horror episodes, some being my all-time favourites. Blink, Midnight and Turn Left I all give a 10 out of 10, and would say that the latter is my absolute favourite of the revival. For me, this more recent entrant I give simply an 8 out of 10, so it's not quite at the top of the Doctor Who pantheon for me, but a solid entrant to it, and original as well, as I do not recall the show tackling folk horror in such a head-on way. Maybe the Curse of Fenric to an extent, but still. Dot and Bubble followed, and whereas it is fine, it's ultimately unoriginal, having watched most of Black Mirror. It was seen as Doctor Who doing an episode of this other show, however instead of it having new and original ideas in the vein of it ended up taking things from the Black Mirror textbook and or universe and just put them into an episode of Doctor Who. The ending left me in 2 minds, however. Before we got to the 2-part finale, we had one more episode, and the most controversial of them all probably, Rogue. This Bridgerton-esque episode I was on board with until I decided the only way for it to progress was to exploit the homophobia of the time for a key event to happen. As I've already said, I'm not homophobic, and I'm in support of the LGBTQ+ community, but the point is that this was an incredibly bad way for your episode to progress, particularly for one screen during Pride Month. It was just lazy and felt like it was there for the sake of preaching the month in question to the masses. Then we got to The Legend of Ruby Sunday, the first of the two-part conclusion to the series. After a shaky first 6 episodes, would Russell be able to bring forward a satisfactory finale to the first season of this new era of the show? Well, for this first episode, he definitely had a promising start, an extremely promising one. If you have seen my 5-video arc on the channel being the Doctor Who fandom, you'll know how I've generally felt on the Jodie Whittaker and Chris Chibnall era of the show, and hopefully my summation of my thoughts on the 60th anniversary specials is insightful enough. It was a wide array of promise, good ideas and disappointments, with a few positive episodes here and there. The mediocrity of the show at that current point in time and the worsening fandom really soured me to not only being a part of the Whovian community, but being a fan of the show inadvertently. I would still call myself a mega fan of 1960s Doctor Who, but maybe a very slightly above average fan for the rest of the show. As such, and because it has been a lifelong tradition for most of my life at this point, 20 years, I've always tuned in for the newest episode because it's tradition, as I said. However, I haven't been a fan of everything the past 7 years has resulted in for the show, and I don't think all of it has quite worked out. So, with all of that contextualizing me, along with the vast amount of shows I have watched since branching out from Doctor Who, I hope you viewers can at least get and understand a fraction of the impact that this episode had on me. When watching reactions to this episode on YouTube, it made me quite emotional, to be honest, as it lets sink in the fact that what had just been broadcasted as the 7th episode of this series was one of the best in many years. I give The Legend of Ruby Sunday a full 10 out of 10, and I gave none of the 13th or 14th Doctor's episodes that rating, and honestly can't remember the last time a new episode scored that high for me. I don't even recall if I gave any of Peter Capaldi's episodes that score. It made me think back to when I was a kid watching RTD1, being swept away by Bad Wolf and The Parting of the Ways, Army of Ghosts and Doomsday, as well as the last 3 episodes of Series 4. It took me back to a place in my childhood, back when Doctor Who used to astound and amaze me. I think personal history of the show has led to me having such a very justifiable resonance of emotions and profundity with this episode. There are more than one hinges that the plot swings and articulates itself on in this episode and in the overall finale, some of which are amazing. I think I audibly uttered "holy shit" in my all but one person empty home when Ncuti said, "Susan is the name of my granddaughter." As big of a 1960s fan of the show as I am, I never even considered the possibility of her returning to the show as a regenerated incarnation. How this misdirection is done by RTD as well is so perfect as well, because it made me actually think that it was Susan Foreman because of the TARDIS anagram present in the name Susan Triad. It made me think that she was somehow trying to get a message to the Doctor. Well, they were, but it turns out it was Sutekh all along, or at least a minion of the unholy deity. The Doctor realising he got the wrong anagram as well is another brilliant "oh shit" type of moment. A masterfully done bit of misdirection. In terms of a personal connection to this episode outside of what emotional impact it had on me, this is definitely the biggest one, but is not the only amazing use of continuity that this episode does. The whole resolutionary feel to Ruby's character arc that this installment does and how it swings back around to the church on Ruby Road is incredible. Despite some of the misfires that this series had in regards to episodes, I was still really able to connect with Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson's portrayals of the lead 2 characters, as they acted well and were well written characters. This really added another emotional angle to this episode and made the moment in which Ruby is crying about her mum all the better. The cliffhanger and ending as well is one of the most colossal and Herculean that the show has ever had. I have issues with Sutekh in the greater context of the story with the Empire of Death, so details to come, but their actual return is nothing I was against, and it made for a refreshing villain return rather than it just being the Daleks or Cybermen again. The weight of the return of such an iconic villain from the Tom Baker era is just made even better by how damn good the rest of the episode is. As mentioned with 73 Yards, I'm a big fan of supernatural horror. In turn, I am very on board with the mythos Russell T Davies is trying to develop here, in terms of what I'll call the pantheon of Doctor Who gods. In other words, the hierarchy that he is developing and expanding, with the legend of Ruby Sunday mentioning the Celestial Toymaker, the Mara, the Trickster, Maestro and Sutekh being in the same echelon. Should be noted here that the Giggle apparently mentioned the gods of Ragnarok from the greatest show in the galaxy also. A very interesting thing to have in your new 10-year, and I like the expansive supernatural mythos tinged type thing that he is going for, which was subtly introduced back in Wild Blue Yonder, with the implementation of the story element of demons needing to count the amount of rice grains spilled on the floor. She was underused in part 2, but I like how this episode also continues on from the Giggle and the aspect of this iteration of units being used again, namely with the companion of Melaine Bush being reintroduced. It's a nice thing to include, and I like how it is a continuation from the power of the Doctor, with the idea of past companions coming back to work for UNIT. In the Empire of Death, however, she is quite underused and is mainly there for an admittedly well done dichotomy of the Doctor, but I'll get into that in a bit. Overall, I was riveted by the legend of Ruby Sunday and rocked by it on an emotionally personal level. I think it is one of the most well-written episodes of Doctor Who in many years. I would say this episode is more than deserving of a 10 out of 10 and is easily one of the best episodes of the show ever written by Russell T Davies. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the Empire of Death. Whereas it could have been better, like a lot better, it could have been much worse as well. It is another disappointing series finale, but there were a couple bits to it that I did like and was satisfied by. In the episode, at about 15 or so minutes in, there is a shot of the Doctor, Ruby and Mel looking out of a TARDIS followed by a fade to black. Everything up to this point I think I was on board with and it started promising. The memory TARDIS is a bit whatever, but to me it's a Doctor Who thing that seems like it would work within the universe. So despite it being a little silly, I'm forgiving of it. Plus it plays into something that I will detail a little later on, which I quite like that aspect of. When we come back into the episode is when things start to unravel and fall apart. The elephant in the room is Sutekh. As I mentioned, I was on board with his return, but ultimately he is wasted for the most part. By the point of the fade out mentioned, his plan is done and it has been successfully executed, so it's just a matter of the Doctor figuring out the solution and reversal. In my interpretation, the main narrative thrust there is to the Empire of Death is this dichotomy shown, which is showing what good the Doctor can do and what bad he can do. This is easily the most well executed part of the episode and made it worthwhile watching amidst all the other flaws. The latter half of the dichotomy is displayed by Sutekh executing his plan. It is revealed that at the end of the Pyramids of Mars, the villain was able to escape and essentially piggyback on the TARDIS and in turn create an impression at wherever the Doctor landed for the next several decades of in-show time. They then use these planetary bookmarks to annihilate where our hero has gone, in turn showing and raising the question, our hero has travelled time and space, visited many worlds and civilizations, but what are the consequences? It all comes to a head before the fade to black, in which the Doctor screams in anguish at what he has done, in a brilliant display of the character faced with something they have never thought of before, to my knowledge. Whereas an alien, they still have many traits and facets of humanity in them. I think including something like this in the show is a great way to flesh out their character and show what emotions that go through them. Russell did it once before with the moment between Ten and Wilf at the end of time, and it was brilliant there as well. How Sutekh is used in regard to showing what I'm assuming was Davis's main goal with this finale is brilliant, but in terms of how they are used in the overall framework of the finale is non-existent. What I mean by that is, as I said, his plan is very much fully executed and done by the end of The Legend of Ruby Sunday and at the beginning of The Empire of Death. The last 40 minutes of the story does not really use him at all, aside from an absolutely ridiculous solution as I will get into. I do get why RTD would want to bring them back as not only a showcasing of this dichotomy, but to further expand this hierarchy of Doctor Who deities. But other than that, the baddie here isn't really used at all. The way that they realise Sutekh as well is odd. Instead of the iconic design as present in the original 4th Doctor story, we get this big gargoyle-like entity that just sits on top of the TARDIS for the majority of Part 2. I and many others love the Egyptian-themed design of the original iteration, and I found it disappointing that it didn't at least make some form of an appearance in the Empire of Death. Since this is such a powerful entity, it could be fair to say that they would be able to shapeshift to at least some extent. As such, I feel his original Osiris version could have made some appearance in the story in a special scene. Plus, much of the Egyptian mythological appeal that there was in the original Tom Baker story is missing. The robot mummies don't even make an appearance. As mentioned, I do not have anything against the idea of a memory TARDIS. Yeah, it's a little silly, but it seems like something feasible within the universe of the show. Plus, it is a way of showing how much good the Doctor has had, or can do and has done, and what effect they have had. For example, Mel sentimentally touching the 6th Doctor's coat. How it is used within the grander context of the story, however, is unreal and super stupid. I get the idea that Ncuti was able to defeat Sutekh using items with special time travel centralized significance, but are you really asking me to take seriously the fact that he defeats an almighty entity with a glove, rope and a fucking whistle? Even his minion in the cliffhanger of Part 1 says that he is the greatest god of all, implying some extremely difficult and foreboding challenge to defeat. Mel is underused here and doesn't really get to do much, unfortunately. She does play a bit into showing what good the Doctor can do, gets possessed by Sutekh at one point and does help out quite a bit in the first 15 minutes, aka pre-Fade to Black, but doesn't really do a thing for the majority of this episode. Thankfully, however, Ruby is much better written and used here, but things to do with her character leads into yet more problems. This was one part of the episode that satisfied me and is the most major part of the positive side to the dichotomy present, in that the Doctor is able to reunite her with their mum at long last. Miss Sunday was a really good companion and well acted by Millie Gibson. I enjoyed watching her in the recent episodes, and her getting this closure here is fitting and poignant. Her character conclusion here also displays how well Russell was able to resolve the arc of the series as started in the Church of Ruby Road, for the most part, as there is a few unanswered questions here and there, such as why does it snow everywhere Ruby goes, but for the most part it was quite well tied up and what have you, despite a few loose threads and what have you not answered at all or even addressed. Now, whereas I like her mother being introduced and this being the way that the companion story is completed here, it is this new character that is also perhaps the most confusing and poorly written in regards to two major moments with the proceedings. The first is the revelation that her pointing, as seen in Unit's device in Legend, is actually her naming their child, as they were pointing at the road sign for the location of the church. Right, if you were dumping your child here at the church doorstep as you did, surely you would have told somebody their name in the process of doing so. What were they expecting to achieve by pointing at the sign without knowing that anybody else was around? Did they know that the doctor would be present and would see her pointing somehow? Point one on its own made no sense, but the second here is tenfold. Apparently Sutek was afraid of Ruby's mother for some reason, and that is why they let the Doctor and his two companions live, because he knew that they would be able to figure out who they were. When the episode reveals her mother, they are shown as being very much a human being and look very normal. Therefore, why on earth was the villain so damn afraid of her? Why was such a powerful creature scared of a human being? One theory I heard before the episode aired is that the cloaked figure seen in the VHS tape is in fact the trickster from the Sarah Jane adventures. Now, it could be that this is in fact the monster seen on the VHS tape dropping Ruby off at the church as a part of some greater plan that will later on be developed. Do keep in mind that the trickster was mentioned by Sutek's minion in the cliffhanger of Legend of Ruby Sunday, but as of now it just doesn't make much sense to me at all. In future perhaps this will be explained, but for now this is a perplexing aspect to quite an underwhelming finale that leaves a few bits unanswered. Unfortunately, despite how much I adored and had a personal resonance with part 1, the end to the whole shebang is incredibly messy and underwhelming. Once again, this is another episode like The Power of the Doctor, where I have to sift through the silt and mud to find gold nuggets, of which there are a few in an ultimately average but still satisfying in areas finale.